I think we will get started officially. I want to welcome you all and thank you very much for coming. My name is Janelle Posnick and I am the curator of contemporary art with the Campbell River Art Gallery, and it's really nice to see all your faces, and we so appreciate friends and family and board members and participants being with us today. So I'd like to acknowledge with respect that we live and learn daily on the traditional unceded territories of the Lake Wataw speaking peoples of the Weewakam, and Kuyaka First Nations, whose relationship with the land continues to this day. When doing an acknowledgement of territory, I think about my own Western and Eastern familial roots, and the way I identify with those histories, stories, and sensory experiences makes me who I am. The long histories and relationships with landscapes and customs across Turtle Island make Indigenous communities what they are. I know there is so much work to be done in uncovering what has been lost or taken, and I have deep respect for the endurance of communities and resurgence of culture. We all have a role to play in making space for that work to happen, whether it is active or supportive. So grateful to Jamelie and Soheila for working with the Craig to produce this beautiful and impactful show, Translations. It hasn't been an easy time to forge ahead, and I am so thankful for their willingness to work with me throughout a tumultuous and changing process. The exhibition addresses the translation of aspects of Arabic and Iranian cultures into the Canadian context. The concept of third space and the critical need for empathy for those folks that live in the space that is neither here nor there were driving forces behind this show. The work of these artists exemplify forms of translation that occur from one culture to the next in wonderfully different ways that help to illuminate and expand the topic. It is my pleasure to moderate this discussion today, and I'm really looking forward to what I know will be an illuminating exchange, and I thank you all very much for taking the time to be present with us today. Before I introduce Jamelie and Soheila, I would like to take a brief moment to thank our funders. This exhibition, programming, and essay publication were made possible through the generous support we received from our funding partners, the Canada Council for the Arts, British Columbia Arts Council, the Province of British Columbia, the City of Campbell River, and the Ontario Arts Council. In addition, we would like to thank Rung Magazine for their generous support and partnership. Jamili Hassan's work often has a personal dimension to it. She incorporates her travels to the Middle East, family experiences, and history into the work she makes. She has a widely varied approach in the media that is utilized. One of 11 children of Lebanese immigrants, Hassan grew up in an Arabic-speaking household in London, Ontario. She studied at the Academy of Fine Arts, Rome, École des Beaux-Arts, Beirut, the University of Windsor, and the University of Mustansiriya in Baghdad. She began working full-time as an artist in 1972 and has exhibited widely in Canada and internationally since then. Her art uses photography, text, and existing cultural artifacts to make cross-cultural references. It responds to worldwide concerns, cultural displacement, or the narratives of intersecting cultures. Hassan's perspective has also been shaped by lifelong international travel. Issues surrounding human rights, political conflict, and cultural displacement have been a driving force throughout her art practice. She challenges viewers to reevaluate their perceptions of cultural histories and the importance of civic responsibility. She is an award-winning artist honored with the Governor General's Award in 2001 in recognition of her artistic achievement. At that time, the jury also acknowledged her activism, curatorial practice, and contributions to the artist-run center movement in Canada. Sahela Espahani grew up in Tehran, Iran, and moved to Canada in 1992. She received her Master of Fine Arts degree from the University of Western Ontario and her BA in Fine Arts from the University of Waterloo. Her recent work questions displacement, dissemination, and reinsertion of culture by recontextualizing culturally specific ornamentation and various collected souvenir-type objects. She navigates the terrains of cultural translation by exploring ornamentation as a form of portable culture that can be carried across cultures and nations. Her recent practice aims to destabilize the origin of culture and reconstruct Homi Bhabha's The Third Space of In-Betweenness, a site of cultural translation where locations of cultures are negotiated and new narratives are adapted and hybridized. She is an award-winning visual artist and recipient of numerous grants. In 2016, she received the Waterloo Regional Arts Award and was nominated for the Jamile Prize at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London in 2015. Her work has been exhibited across Canada from Vancouver to Halifax and collected by various public and private institutions. She's currently a lecturer at the University of Waterloo. So we will get started with our conversation. We have questions that we will exchange back and forth. You're welcome to save your questions for the end. We will allow for a question period. And you can also put things in the chat or raise your hand if you have something that you want to say. And then at the end, we will play a fun game of Kahoot. So you can download the app for free on your mobile phone, and we will share the screen with you, and we can all play the game together. And then we have this wonderful prize that which is a jar of homemade apricot jam, the Alden's Gift catalog, the catalog for Boutros Al-Armenian, and I will also include a copy of the exhibition essay that I wrote for this exhibition as well. So I'm going to start with Jamelie. You have had a long and successful career thus far and have made many profound artworks. Yet we have new mosaics of yours in the Translations exhibition. You're constantly exploring new modes of representation and new avenues of thought. Where do you feel you are currently in the arc of your career, and what new foci do you have on your horizon?
Sorry, everyone. Thank you, Janelle. Thank you for all your work, and just want to acknowledge how great it's been to share ideas with you and with Soheila in the process. When you first contacted me, it's really lovely actually when a curator that you haven't actually met contacts you and says that you're interested in a show. And you had this idea to put Soheila and I together, which I think is a very rich project to explore. And I hope the viewers there have enjoyed it. In terms of where I am in my work, it's a very funny thing because you can do a lot of research and the material actual result of that work may not arrive into the studio practice until decades later. So for all my life, I've been very interested in mosaics, and having studied both in Rome and in Lebanon, in Beirut, I was obviously surrounded by not only archaeological sites within the city itself, but also the beautiful mosaic and that skilled craftsmanship that throughout the ages has been part of the architecture of and craftsmanship of that part of the world. So it's not surprising that at a certain point in time that I would arrive at physically wanting to do a mosaic. And I've really just limited myself to begin with smaller pieces, but I do intend to explore the idea and make more installed, more site-specific relationships with the mosaics, as I have done with my ceramic works. So there's without a doubt a connection between, you're always circling around, you're always circling forward, backwards, in and out. There's not a direct methodology or conceptual frame. It is really an opportunity to explore different ways of working. And sometimes it's pragmatic. Like for instance, I stopped working on a large scale in ceramic because I developed a respiratory problem with the ceramic, with the clay dust itself. So the space that I was previously working in ceramic became a really big library. so there's a change that actually happened physically within my own space. And so the relationship to the library, the archive, has also been a pretty common and present reality for me. And so there's this crossover between the physical work, the labor that's involved in doing the work, but also the research behind the work.
I think it's so nice for people to hear that, just have that reinforced, that things aren't necessarily linear or chronological, that everything kind of is looping back and moving and twisting around, and it provides this really beautiful picture of how we all kind of exist and how we synthesize our own experiences. And I'm really excited to see what kinds of large-scale mosaics you're able to create. I'm sure that they'll be phenomenal.
Thank you.
So I would like to bring a point of theory that Jamili and Soheila utilize or reference in their work to add some context. I've mentioned before the third space, defined by Homi Bhabha in his seminal text, The Location of Culture, is a place of dialogue that stretches across subjects and disciplines, where the meanings and symbols of culture are not homogeneous or fixed. Known signs can be translated, rehistoricized, and read anew. Now, I would like to read a quotation that we have both in the exhibition and in the essay from Soheila. I have departed my original home, Iran, and now live in the third space, identifying as neither Canadian nor Iranian, but someone in between. Since the third space hinges on an act of negotiation, the audience's interaction with my art is crucial. Viewers' unique experiences and cultures inform their reading of the work, thus allowing them to enter the third space by engaging in cultural translation. The viewers carry their culture across onto my art and vice versa. Soheila, can you speak to this journey or carrying across that occurs when a viewer engages with your work?
I think it's very interesting that as an artist who most of my work focus on a specific culture, to see how my audience look at my work. And it's interesting to see that no matter how culturally specific a work is, the audience always bring back notions from what they know and how they perceive culture or how they have experienced a particular culture. So that always comes into the way people see or translate the work. So that's what I sort of love about the kind of a work that I do, is even though I'm trying to focus people to something specific, it's almost like it's never possible because there are these gaps, there are these in-between spaces that we always fill in, and we fill that in with the kind of experience that we have.
Thank you. That's so interesting. When we talk to viewers, often, there's this kind of wall between viewers and art, and there's this conception that, oh, I don't understand it, or I won't know about it. And we try frequently to speak to viewers about using those experiences. And sometimes we don't even realize that we're engaging in this process of filling in and smoothing out those kind of cracks and fissures that we don't quite understand about things. And we're always bringing those experiences to everything that we see around us.
And I think that's is the strength of art and art making, because it allows for those things to come out and be negotiated in, let's say, a safe space. Whereas sometimes these kinds of differences or similarities or different ways of seeing and perspectives in other subjects, in sort of social moments, become more contagious and becomes more of a hard thing to explain. Rather, in art, it seems that people can connect to it in a different level. So they feel that it's easier to talk about the differences or to talk about what they see that may not be the original as what the artist is trying to say.
Very good point. Jamelie, what are your thoughts on this active element of visitor engagement and the process of translation that the public goes through when interacting with your artwork?
Well, I think that what Soheila has said, that there's always something that you learn from the viewer that comes back to you, and that you're kind of in this bit of a drive to arrive at some relationship to what you're making, but it's quite intuitive sometimes, and there's a certain amount of energy that's feeding into it from other people and things you've read, and all kinds of like what Mikhail Bakhtin talked about, like this carnival of voices, that a work of art isn't a single authorship. It doesn't actually happen until an audience, someone, whether it's one person or more than one person, engages with that work. And so that dialogue that happens, he was very much into the dialogical. So that relationship was very, very important. So the whole idea that we have a dialogue, that the conversation that needs to take place. And as Soheila says, that the art gallery is often a space. Right now, I mean, inside spaces are difficult spaces. So now we're turning to like outdoor spaces where people can feel a kind of relationship to the public art world through nature, which I think is a really important aspect of what we are going through right now, is that the pause has demanded of us actually to consider our relationship not only to interior spaces as artists, but also to the prolonged impact that this circumstance is going to have upon us. So this relationship of a kind of separate space, or the white cube, is completely irrelevant from my point of view. I've always worked across disciplines, and I've always worked in a way where I've tried to dismantle some of that hierarchy and that structure within the institution that attempts to control how we are relating to each other and how we have relationships with the world, and the world being what it is at this particular time. Some writers and commentators have talked about it as nature's revenge. So the relationship, I think, to how we reflect, how we think about what's going on at this time is extremely important. And obviously, one of the questions that you have posed for me is this relationship to travel. So Soheila and I had this big, lovely plan that we would travel to Campbell River and be out there, and our BC connections and families would enjoy that exhibition with us. But of course, that was all canceled. So, a lot of people say to me, "Oh, Jamelie, you're so lucky. You've actually got an exhibition happening right now." How many contemporary artists can have that happening unless it was already set up before the onset of the pandemic? So I know I've diverted quite a bit, but I mean, I think that that's sort of one of the questions, is what happens in relation to audience, because we would always sort of judge something as being successful on the number of people who showed up. Whereas a lot of communities, it's not like that at all. It's never been like that. In a lot of traditional societies, what is important is that you have a real conversation, you have a dialogue, that it's really important, that it's a meaningful exchange. And sometimes that can't happen obviously in huge, spectacular kind of events. So sometimes the more immediate and the quieter exchange is the one that is going to really make a difference for the artist and where the artist might go with their work. And one of the things that we look at when we think about, you know, what is the most exciting thing for an artist is like to be invited to go somewhere, you know, to leave your studio and go somewhere. Well, that's not that exciting at this moment in time. You know, so when we come across a really exciting scholar or artist and we think, oh, we need to bring them to London, we get really excited about that idea. And then right now we're like, well, why is that such an important aspect that we have that one-on-one with someone whose works that we're reading that we admire? Because in fact, I think that that relationship, that the one-on-one, that maybe we just took it for granted.
Yeah.
That now we understand that these are encounters that are extremely significant and important to us.
And the idea of bringing them into the real space and interfacing with them on a personal level adds so much. And it, you know, it kind of enables you to take all of the ideas that you've gleaned from their works and then, you know, express your appreciation, but also to kind of move forward from that. And, you know, you're moving from a kind of two-dimensional or three-dimensional object to the piece of art or the thing the person responds to you at that juncture. And so then you do have this more active dialogue, whereas you're talking about this kind of quiet repose that you're getting either from a public display or even in the art gallery. I do agree with you in many ways about the white cube. But I do also think that at this juncture, those spaces are our safe spaces at this moment, and they are places where we can go and reflect. And I agree that in some ways, we do have to try to create that conversation and that dialogue within the gallery. And it takes away a little bit from the organic nature in that respect, but also it's so important for us to plan and make space and make room for those conversations to happen and to create those opportunities.
I also agree that it's still an activist space.
Yeah.
That gallery, that when that gallery brings in the activism into the space, that there is an action going on there that can destabilize in a number of ways the orthodoxy. So when I'm referring to that white cube, I'm referring to it more in the, you know, the really institutional framework that many artists have, why artist-run centers emerged, in fact, was to challenge that.
Absolutely.
To be more spontaneous and to recognize that the engagement with socio-political realities and injustices needed to be addressed.
Yeah, that's why we're here.
Yeah.
So, Soheila, can you tell us a little bit about your journey from Iran to Canada? Please talk a little bit about periods of adjustment and ways that you grappled with the push and pull of identities that you describe when you talk about the third space. Would you say these experiences have been formative in the development of your professional art practice?
Well, I came to Canada when I was about 20 years old, so fairly young and fairly naive, thinking that I'm going to come in as a student. I came as a student and study and go back, and that sort of never happened. And it's interesting, I came from a background of studying 1 year of architecture back in Iran, and then came here to continue that. And for multiple reasons, I actually couldn't do it and ended up in fine arts. So I always feel that lucky that part of being an artist was the fact that I moved to Canada, because if I had not come to Canada, I would have studied architecture and became an architect at the end of the day. So it's definitely that move and the challenges that move brought to me sort of shifted my course to becoming an artist. And over the years, all the work that I have done has always been some sort of a response to who am I as the person that's here? So I've, in my earlier work, when I was doing paintings based on poems by Rumi, a lot of times those poems were reflections of the moments of my life. There was a whole series that I did with a very famous poem by Rumi talking about the reed flute and how the song that that comes out of the flute is actually the morning song to go back to its roots, to go back to the reed bed. And made those series when I was like about like after 10 years I had lived in Canada, and all of a sudden I felt very homesick. And you would not think that you will be very homesick when you're 10 years living in a place. You think the second place has become more of a home. So I sort of made a series of paintings that looked like beds of water, sort of reed beds and things like that to sort of connect to that. One of the more interesting also times that I made work thinking about the movement and where I'm from and where I'm going was when I actually had lived in Canada the same number of years as I had lived in Iran. So I was at this point of, now who are you? Are you a Canadian or are you an Iranian? Do you sort of label yourself from where you were born and sort of grew up, or you label yourself where you lived as an adult? So in response to that, I actually had an opportunity to exhibit in a local gallery in Kitchener-Waterloo area. For people from this area know Homer Watson Gallery. Homer Watson is a famous Canadian landscape painter who lived in Kitchener. And I sort of responded to, and the gallery is basically his house. And at that moment, I was very much thinking about being a local artist and what does it mean to be a local artist? Am I a local artist that I lived a long time in Kitchener-Waterloo, or am I still an artist that my work responds to the first culture that I live in? And sort of as moving on, now I'm thinking as movement and culture and my sort of personal life. Now when I go back to Iran, I feel like a tourist in my home country. So now I have this role of the outsider of the culture, even though I'm still very connected to the culture. And that's where that kind of a third space in betweenness comes into play, because neither I'm Canadian nor I'm Iranian, and no matter where I am, I'm still in that third space, even if I'm in Iran now. It's not home in that sense anymore. And I'm still in that space when I'm in Canada. And that challenge, that sort of way of thinking is quite interesting. I don't think I'm interested in moving out of that space. I think the unstable questioning moment of that space is quite interesting to me.
I agree. I think that I follow where you are there, and I think that this idea of the third space is a space that is fluid, that allows for not putting yourself in any particular box. Where at the same time, I mean that there's obviously tremendous overflows of influences that are inspiring your work, that are coming from where you were born and where you grew up until you were 20. And I was wondering if you've ever shown in Tehran.
I've actually never shown in Iran. So, and that's very interesting. I actually never studied art in Middle East, and I've never studied art in a formal way rather than Western art. So my training is very much of a Western artist. But for some reason, my art has always that kind of an Eastern influence within it. So even though I've never studied it in school. Later on, in recent years, I have done a lot of research on my own. But yeah, I've never shown my work in Iran or Middle East. It would be an interesting idea to do it. One of my questions always is that would my audience in Iran relate to the work the same? So now I feel like I make work for a Western audience, and I don't make work for audience that are from that culture. So it would be interesting to see how they react to the kind of a cultural experience that I bring in my work within the context of that culture.
Yeah. Do you think that that fluidity, the ability to kind of exist outside of these identities or not be defined by them gives you a certain like objectivity or an ability to kind of look high over the crowd and see the larger picture in some instances?
I think so. I think partly it does that. Partly, I think more important than that is that it gives me very different perspectives. So I can look from various perspectives at the same time. And I think it's, if it's not a conscious effort and if you're not aware of it, it's hard for most people to do that, to be able to move between perspectives that may not be necessarily sort of aligning at the same time. So I don't know if what Jamili's experience is with that. Do you feel you're looking sort of up and above?
Well, I think there's something very different going on here. I mean, I remember when I went to study in the late 1960s in Beirut, a lot of my relatives were going the other way. So the privilege of being able to study or travel to, quote, the West and have an education from Canada, United States at that time was highly desirable. But from my perspective, going the other way had a tremendous amount of appeal for me. And that probably had a lot to do with our family's stories as I was growing up and relatives that came to visit and that sort of thing, which really made me want to continue my education as a art education in the Arab world, as opposed to that education being exclusively in the Western world. But interestingly enough, when I was quite young, I went to Dune School of Fine. I went to that Dune summer school camp.
That's amazing.
Which is the Homer Watson gallery that Soheila is talking about. And it was actually a neighbor of ours who said to my mom and dad, you know, maybe she would benefit from going to a summer art school camp. And so I went. I think I was about 15 or 16. I went to that camp. And so, I mean, for my parents, I mean, that was a big deal, like that I would be in that camp, an art camp, which lasted 2 weeks, and hang out with a bunch of bohemian artists. And but some of those are really good artists that were teaching there, and I really liked it. And then the woman who was running the camp, Mrs. Hamilton, said, well, if you want to extend your time, you can work here and you can just stay on here at the camp. So my parents said, yeah, that's okay, she can do that. And I did that. So I think already, I mean, I was really already self-identifying myself as an artist when I was extremely young. And I figured that a traditional education in the arts would be in the visual arts would serve me better than an academic education at that time. So that was really something that I was highly motivated to, and also because I had the opportunity to grow up around artists. So I had an idea of what it was to be an artist by the time I was about 10. because of the artists that were moving around in the London arts community, including our immediate neighbor, Solwyn Dewdney, and his wife, Irene Dewdney. So there was a lot of openness within our household for art and culture. As you know, in terms of traditional realities and desires and those sorts of things, they were all present. But also what was welcome was this idea that, you know, education was extremely important, but if you had a really strong idea about your skill or your talent or whatever, my parents were quite open to that. So I can actually remember when later on, when I became friends with Greg Curnow, he said to me, "Oh, you know, it must have been really difficult for you to follow your desires to be an artist because you came from a Muslim family. It'd be your dad must have been really conservative." And I'm going, "Oh, no, he wasn't. You know, you're more conservative than he ever was." That Greg sort of represented this sort of patriarchal kind of status within the art community in London. And to have patronage from someone like Greg Curnow, to have his connection and his friendship, was mostly like among other young male artists. It was very rarely that women artists that were coming up would be recognized in that period in the early 70s. So that kind of relationship to sort of like a feminist art practice, that was also really strong in my situation. And so it wasn't a particularly, I mean, it wasn't an oppressive environment at all for me in terms of growing up in London, Ontario. What was oppressive was the occasion, you know, the situations where you were made to feel different. It was recognized that you were not Protestant, or you're not Catholic, that you were different, that, you know, those sorts of things. So the discrimination that emerged at that time when we entered into the public school system, that's the experience that our adjustments required us to do that. So we all had different experiences in terms of, as a large family, a number of kids. Mom and dad had 11 kids. So, you know, we were like an army on the street. We controlled the neighborhood. There was definitely, you know, a certain sense of empowerment, I would say, that I did not feel, even with whatever negativities that were coming at us. I never really felt that I couldn't fight back. So I think that a lot of the relationships in terms of my relationship to my local community has been extremely significant and important. But it's different than the regionalism that defines the cultural practice of London, Ontario, of the Greg Curnow and Jack Chambers generation, in that there's this international element that enters into the discourse and the practice of artists here in London today, which it largely is a result of the work that people like myself and Ron Benner have done, is to sort of work with artists from all over the world, but not exclusively, but also to work with local artists, regional issues, indigenous issues. And certainly a lot of the programming that we had done in the past through the Artist Run Center system looked at many of the same issues that we're dealing with right now, with protest movements and Black Lives Matter, Indigenous Lives Matter, those kinds of questions. So I think that that whole kind of relationship to education and vocation, and how one finds one's connection to community, is really quite complex, I would say.
Definitely. Thank you both so much. Where are we now? So
I think we covered a couple of your questions there already.
Yeah, we did. I'm going to go to, I'll ask you now about how your travels have informed your artworks. I'm thinking specifically about artworks like Al Haq Al Kanadiye, which is from 2017. but the experiences you had that led to its creation occurred in 67 to 68 in Lebanon. And Boutros Al-Armenian came to fruition several years after you received the video footage that was used to create the artwork, which is also in this exhibition. I'm very interested in what I see as long or changing periods of percolation in your work, as you've spoken to that a little bit today, but I was just wondering if you could expand on that.
Well, yeah, I think that sometimes it's really important to put the research material aside for a period of time, and particularly if the research material came about by a certain kind of personal connection or family connection. You have to work through a lot of the challenges and ethics that are involved in working through the narrative and those kinds of revealing the stories. And so oral traditions are really important in my own practice, and stories that have been told to me by, in particular, my mother or my father, or elders in the community, in the villages when I lived there as a student. So even a fragment of something will trigger, you know, another relationship to this story. And I think that my process is very much like that, that the fragment of something is sometimes more important than having the whole big thing. And wanting to do, like, for instance, Boutros Al-Armenian actually came out of a project where I was doing research on the National Museum in Beirut. And it had been on the Green Line, which was during the war in Lebanon. So it had been shuttered and protected by the museum director. And I was very, very interested in that project when it was going to be reopened and renovated. So part of my research was to actually go there for that purpose. But when I got there, all my efforts kind of fell apart. So that was a really public history project, which was really important. And when that door closed, what opened was this more personal, subjective story. So my brain was already kind of working on looking at narratives from Lebanon and thinking about my studies there as a student and community at that time. So I think that you've already got a kind of strategy in your head that you think it's going to go in a certain way. It doesn't go that way, but you need to somehow to reassemble it so that it makes some kind of sense. And so shortly after I returned from that research trip, my mom actually received a video letter of the project that was happening in the renovation of my grandfather's house. And so the connection, like this is my maternal grandfather, traveled like many young men from that part of the Middle East. They traveled and made their way under a lot of hardships. And in the case of my grandfather, it was almost 20 years that he was in North America before he returned back to Lebanon and built that house. And in that interim, he actually opened a cafe called the Snowball Cafe. And that's the image that you have on exhibit in relation to the Boutros Al-Armenian medallion from the National Gallery. So what that installation is doing for the Campbell River Art Gallery is bringing these two elements and two time periods together and creating a dialogical kind of experience for myself. I thought I'd like to see what happens when you put those two together, because one is like the actual archive photograph of my grandfather in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And the other one is the evidence of what happened so many decades later to his fortune. And what was the story behind that particular circumstance? So there's always these connections. They kind of interlink in various ways. And the same with Al Haq Kennedy. That's one village. That's my father's village. And the other one is my mother's village. And they're side by side, actually on the road in Lebanon. So they kind of come, into a nice I think conceptually in that relationship as you curated it for the gallery there.
Absolutely. You can
Does
really
that answer your question?
Yes. No, it really does, and it fills out a lot for me, and I'm really interested in the process, and I think you've touched on some really interesting points, the kind of sensitivities and the ethics around sharing family stories and your own emotional relationship to those events, and how you're able to kind of carry over that process and then synthesize it into a project. And I love the image and the idea of a kind of fragment being almost the seed, the most important part, and everything that your mind and your creativity grows everything around it and adds to it afterward. I think that's wonderful. Thank you. So Soheila, can you please speak to the way in which you conduct interventions onto known objects or patterns of Western European culture, such as the willow pattern, a well-known English blue and white pattern in your artwork? 7 must have elements of willow pattern: 2 birds, fence, weeping willow, orange tree, boat, pagoda, 3 men on bridge.
So in recent years, I've been questioning an original or origin of culture. And that partly also came with the way Jamili works. I think Jamili sort of looking at Jamili's work had put this seed in my way of thinking of how do we sort of connect to an original or an origin. And those fragments, in her work, I see that kind of a detective work to sort of get to what is an story and how do you get the original of the story. So, and the other thing that I've been thinking about is that idea of that why do people sort of collect souvenir objects and how do these objects move around? If you're an immigrant, you tend to bring knickknacks that have a presence of your culture, a plate with an image that represents your culture. If you're a tourist, you also do the same thing. You go to a country, you buy a plate that has an image of that culture and bring it back as a keepsake, as a reminder of that culture. So, so sort of this idea of who picks the cultural objects and how does it move or how does it come about was one of the things that interested me. So I started looking at what are some of the specific cultural objects that have been moving around and it's very recognizable. One of them is the blue and white porcelain. We all sort of understand and we all lived with them at one time or another. But the cultural history and the movement is quite interesting. If you look at the history, it's the Chinese culture that produced the blue and white for centuries because they had the technology and nobody else had. And, but over centuries, as it sort of traveled, other cultures claimed it and claimed it in a way as if we sort of now recognize it within that culture. So we can recognize blue and white from Delft as Dutch, like we recognize it very specifically. We can recognize the English versions of them. There are also Islamic versions of them. So even though the origin is China, this pattern has moved around and every time it landed in a culture, they claimed it as if it's their own. So for this one, I was looking at one that is very familiar. Everybody had one of those plates with the willow pattern. My grandmother certainly had a set. I remember it as I was growing up. So if you look at that pattern, it's actually a made up fable by a ceramic company in England in 18th century that knew how these kind of patterns are popular and they sell well. So they basically made up the story of this empress's daughter and the love story and how they turned into lovebirds and sort of ran away. So even though it's very much of what we see as Chinese, it's actually a fake cultural object because they just made it up. So I've been collecting these objects, and because I'm sort of interested in taking over these cultural objects with an origin that we think we know where it's from, but it's not from there. I've been adding patterns of arabesque designs on top of them to even claim them further, even to sort of distort them from the original culture into another culture. So this pattern, the willow pattern, is very famous, and it must have 7 elements, as you sort of named them. 2 of them are the 2 lovebirds, and so on and so forth. So in every piece that I made 7 pieces, and in every piece, the pattern actually covers up 1 element. So the element you're supposed to see, you can't actually see. Sort of thinking about back and forth between the origin, how do we see the origin, how that kind of a movement sort of covers up the origin, and how do these objects play a role in everyday life as art objects or objects of desire.
That's fascinating. And even the idea of the obscurity of meaning, marketing something as this historical tale or this fable, and the marketing is still working. I spoke to someone the other day and they were talking about how it's originally a Japanese story, and so there is this kind of enduring mythology around the story that is perpetuated still today and still creates this popularity and this drive for the possession of this pattern.
And what's interesting, that if this happened now, it would have been a major problem with cultural appropriation.
Absolutely.
But because it happened in the 18th century, we have no problem sort of still using the pattern and calling it Chinese.
That's a very good point. There is this, for some reason, a kind of historical cutoff that makes it okay, because we're, at that point, you're collecting or you're archiving something that's historical, and that acknowledgement isn't always present.
One of the books that I'm reading right now that just arrived in the mail, it is about the influence of Islamic philosophy and thought on the Western world from the period of, you know, around 1400 to 1700. And that there is this idea that the Western is used very broadly in that term, that the representation of the, quote, Islamic world was one where it was the enemy, and therefore you couldn't learn anything from if you were coming from the West, where this author is referring to the rich potential to recognize the kind of circulation of ideas and technologies and methodologies that were fluid across Asia into influencing across the Mediterranean, and what that actually was about. And so it's a long time in coming. And I'm thinking about this author, he, in his introduction, he says, well, I gave the lecture in 1999, but I didn't get the book finished until 2017. So when we talk about things percolating, you know, in terms of research or trying to kind of put it all together, you know, we don't always have the sense of how long it will take for something like that to come, you know, to be a really good scholarly research book with looking at in different languages and looking in different archives. That kind of material needs to be brought forward. And so, I applaud people when they are doing this relationship to, like, you know, where did the blue and white glaze technique come from, and how ongoing that is in terms of its tradition. even the idea of the tulip and its origins within the Turkey, and how, you know, speaking of Delft, how many people think the tulip belongs to the Netherlands, whereas in fact, I mean, it came from Turkey, and all of the tile motifs and designs of the tulip motif are very representative of how important that plant was. And there was a period of time where the tulip itself was like equivalent to gold in the market system. There was this like powerful desire on the part of Europeans to have the tulip plant, until it became cultivated in the way that it did within European gardens. So there's all these sort of, you know, when people start to say, "Oh, did you know the tulip is from Turkey?" I'm like, "Yeah, I know the tulip is from Turkey," and I love the fact that I do know that. I think it's important to know these relationships to colors and influences within motifs in tapestries and ceramic and that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's interesting. Even in the history of the blue and white porcelain, the blue comes from cobalt. And even in early times, the Chinese would get the cobalt from Persia and export it back to China and produce these patterns and China. And a lot of times we think we get everything from China now. Even in 10th century, they would, or even 10th to 15th, 16th century, before other countries were able to produce fine china, they would even get designs from other cultures and produce plates for other cultures and send it back to them. So that sort of back and forth is quite interesting. And it's, we never lived in a bubble. So we always, even when you think people did not have easy modes of transportation, the culture was going back and forth from east to west and west to east. And as Jamili was saying, like tulip is an interesting idea of like, where does it origin is, but how do other cultures claim it? And how do we now recognize a symbol within a particular culture and read it in a different way? I'm sure we read it when we think about tulip as a Dutch motif, we read it very differently than when we look at a tulip from ceramics from Istanbul.
Uh-huh. Well, and that wallpaper in the watercolor that Sam pointed to, that wallpaper was actually developed for the tourist market at the turn of the century. So it was for European consumption. The Japanese weren't actually using wallpaper themselves, but they knew how to make wallpaper, and they created this kind of wallpaper that resembled leather. It's not leather, but it looks like leather, you know, and it's embossed. And because they got a kind of sense of what did Europeans like, what will we create for that market. So at that time, that was what was really interesting about the, you know, the certain things that the family was bringing back. And of course, they have an enormous collection of the blue willow in one of the rooms. It's hanging on the wall. In fact, I think, Soheila, you should do an artist in residency in that house. You should be one of the next artists to do that. That would be really interesting to see what you do with that collection because of all the souvenirs that are in that house. One of the things that is not in the house, though, even though there is actually a piece of pottery by Emily Carr, which I found when I was there in residence. It was like in this dark, dusty cabinet. There's an Emily Carr there. I mean, it's amazing with the indigenous, West Coast indigenous motif. But there is no material in that house that comes from any of the indigenous communities around London, Ontario.
Oh, really?
In Southern Ontario. So the reality is that what was desired, what that particular kind of sensibility, what they were collecting, what they were thinking about, were things that were, you know, from away, more exotic from these places, whether it was from China or India or Japan or Iran, their idea, or Egypt, because they also traveled there. was to bring the world, their idea of what the world was, back home.
Mhm.
Great.
I think this has been a really good, wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, I really thank you both for your input, and it's been really thrilling to hear you fill out things that I've been reading about and thinking about, and I hope that all of you can get an impression of the exhibition from the images that we sent in the package, and that you're able to, in some way, experience what it's like, in addition to hearing this wonderful dialogue, the kind of relationship between these two artists' great works in the exhibition.